October 27, 1962. Sargasso Sea, North Atlantic. Heat has a weight at depth. It sits on shoulders, settles in lungs, films the tongue. In the control room of the Soviet diesel-electric submarine B-59, the air is heavy enough to taste. Diesel, hot insulation, the sour metal of sweat. Condensation runs down pipes and drips, slow and regular, into aluminum pans set to catch it. The electric bulbs are dim to save the last of the batteries. Their weak orange halos carve faces into masks. Every breath buys a little less oxygen. Every minute steals a little more calm. The sonar speaker is a metronome of dread. Ping, ping, ping. American active search, painting them like a spotlight through water. Somewhere up there in the dark, destroyers circle and count. Somewhere up there, aviators in low-flying patrol planes are listening for the tired churn of Soviet propellers. And every so often, the sea slams its fist on the hull and the whole boat shudders. A practiced depth charge, the Americans' way of saying surface now. Inside B-59, the word practice does not exist. Each bang is a promise that the next might be real. Each shock lays a brief night over the already half-lit room. The boat comes back, the lights flutter, the needles on gauges quiver and return. Then the air remembers how not to move again. The thermometers read a number that belongs in boiler rooms, not vessels meant for men. 45 to 50 degrees Celsius in the middle compartments, higher by the engines. In the stern, where the machinery drinks air and hate, it is worse. Carbon dioxide slides upward toward dangerous fractions. Sailors try to nap and cannot. Others sleep and wake with headaches that cut like wire. A few have already slid down a bulkhead to sit where they stand. More will. The ship's doctor marks a tally on a paper scrap, and the paper sticks to his palm. "Drink," he tells a machinist with a salt-stiff neck. "From what?" the man replies, and everyone is quiet because the question is correct. They have been submerged too long. The batteries are nearly done. The air is nearly done. The men are nearly done. But above them, the Americans have made a ring, and in the ring there is no easy up. Captain Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky watches the clock and hates it. To move is to be heard. To be heard is to be chased. To be chased is to be forced to the surface into lights and demands. He has spent hours trying to escape, sinking under thermoclines where the water's temperature tricks sonar into lies, sliding slow and quiet to blind the American ears. But the destroyers are too many, and the planes are too diligent. The USS Coney has found them more than once, and it is joined by others. When the charges fall in fives, an orderly punctuation, some part of his mind says, signaling protocol. When a bigger bang punches the hull and makes a gauge needle snap, another part says, attack. The second part is winning. He looks across the cramped space to his chief of staff, Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov, writing this mission as flotilla deputy commander, equal in rank, senior in authority. Archipov's face is made for not giving anything away. A year earlier, he stood on another submarine, K-19, while a reactor leak cooked men alive. 22 of those comrades will die of radiation sickness, and the rest will carry the invisible souvenir for life. He learned there that panic is just a faster name for death. Now he stands near the chart table, reading the same silence as everyone else, and counting, always counting, battery percentage, oxygen margin, minutes until the next bang, how many minutes you can bargain with before the human brain startles and throws away the bargain. A stronger blast lands close, closer than any they've taken. The boat jumps, lights blink to black, and crawl back to amber. In the forward compartment, a wrench skitters and clatters. Somewhere aft, a man swears in a whisper. The sonar operator rips his headphones down and gasps. Savitsky's jaw locks. He sees it like a photograph, a destroyer above with its guns depressed, an airplane lining up for another pass. He imagines home and what home might look like if those Americans have already fired on Soviet ships elsewhere. There has been no radio contact in days. The world could be on fire, and the only light they have is the wrong kind. Prepare the special weapon. It comes out of him like a cough. Heads turn. The word special carries its own temperature. In tube number 1 under lock and ritual is a T-5 torpedo with a nuclear warhead, about 10 kilotons, a small sun meant to make carriers vanish and admirals reconsider. It was not meant for this exact hour, because no one honest designs an hour like this. But it exists, and with each slam on the hull, it leaves the realm of theater and becomes more available. Arm number 1, load it. Men move because that is what men do when their captain uses the tone for dying well. If this is war, Savitsky says, loud enough for every ghost in the boat to hear, we will not disgrace the Navy. He says the words that will later be repeated and doubted and quoted anyway. Maybe the war has already started. We'll blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov, the political officer, hears his own heart thudding. He is the party's eyes and spine aboard, custodian of doctrine and morale, co-holder of a key in the literal and metaphorical sense. By any book he has ever been asked to read, the captain's order now needs his ratification. But there is another book, unwritten, about the presence of the brigade chief of staff on board. With Arkhipov in this steel room, 3 signatures are the only safe way past the gate. Maslenikov hesitates for a fraction and then moves toward Savitsky, voice low but firm. Valentin, wait. He is not sure whether the word is obedience or mutiny, but he knows the difference between fury and orders. He says the only thing left that sounds like sanity, no confirmation of war, no orders from Moscow. He earns himself a look from Savitsky that could cut iron. Arkhipov moves too, but with the patience of a man who has seen what fury does. Captain, he says, holding Savitsky's eyes, these are signal charges. They want us to surface. Another boom interrupts him. The deck tilts as the boat noses for periscope depth. It is impossible to think without air and time. He tries to buy both. They break shallow. The hatch screws spin, the seal kisses open, and night arrives all at once. Searchlights shear the darkness into white lanes. A plane dives across the bow low, 20-30 meters overhead, and its beam hits the men on the tiny bridge like a fist of light. For a second, Savitsky's eyes go blind, and his brain follows. In that white noise there is also the stitch of automatic cannon, 300 rounds, laid deliberately in the sea alongside the submarine, rather than into it, the American equivalent of a warning slap. We see you. Don't pretend otherwise. On the horizon, destroyers tack and cross with a hunter's appetite, guns trained. Through a bullhorn, words, English words most of the crew do not parse, hammer the air, and understanding comes through tone alone. Savitsky's hand goes for the ladder, emergency dive. Arkhipov blocks him in the tight throat of the conning tower. Look, he says, and because the order is simple, it cuts. They're firing to the side. They're signaling, he says it again. Signaling. Maslenikov appears below them, face pale in the glare. We can send back the signal for surfacing. The next seconds are painter's seconds, thick, slowed, stretched over more space than they should occupy. In those seconds, a destroyer cuts across their bow close enough that the sea lifts, a theater trick meant to bully a collision out of fear. In those seconds, inside the boat, a torpedo officer waits for the sound of a key turning. In those seconds, Arkhipov says, calm, because there is no other way to be heard. If you fire, the war begins, without Moscow, without orders. On us. He does not add what the sentence means to their families, to cities, to mornings. He does not have to. The searchlight burns color out of the world. Savitsky blinks, and when the bridge stops swimming, he nods once. Cancel. He drags the word up from a place that would prefer another. Cancel and surface. The order drops down the ladder like a stone. B-59 pushes up, the Atlantic lets go, and the boat is suddenly an object in a ring of steel and light, rather than a noise found through water. On cue, a helicopter comes to sit over them, and destroyers close like wolves with good table manners. USS Coney semaphores and shouts. Another destroyer slides past, too near for courtesy. Arkhipov tells the signalman to answer, Soviet submarine, surfacing by order. The carrier USS Randolph is somewhere beyond, her planes still making mock attack runs. The professional cruelty of drills performed against a real enemy. Guns stay trained. Light stays on. The ocean makes everything theatrical. Inside the boat, in the torpedo room, the T-5 is taken back down the little tree of steps from ready to closed, and men who have not allowed themselves to sweat suddenly do. On the surface, B-59 drags air into itself through every open hole. In the radio shack, a line wakes and spits a message, proceed north, return to base. The command is thin and final. The mission, Mariel, the imagined berth in a Cuban harbor, the role in the larger play called Anadir, is gone. They will go home. The Americans herd them until the ring grows comfortable again, then let them limp out of sight. The plane's searchlight winks off. The destroyers keep their etiquette of escort until the ocean and the timetable say enough. October 1st, 1962. Polyarny, Kola Peninsula. 3.5 weeks earlier, before the hunt and the heat, there was steel on cold water, and the sound a line makes when it leaves home. At Polyarny, under a night already winter lean, 4 boats slid out under order and secrecy, B-59, B-4, B-36, B-130, a Foxtrot-class quartet sent to a map coordinate no sailor on that pier was supposed to say out loud. The 69th Submarine Brigade had been given a job inside a job, while freighters and freighters disguised as freighters carried missiles and planes and hopes toward Cuba. 4 long diesel boats would give the deployment teeth and eyes. Each carried 22 torpedoes, 21 conventional and 1 special the crews pretended not to think about. Official papers said a nuclear torpedo could only be fired by order. Unofficial whispers said, if you're cut off and dying and they're attacking, do what you must. The truth was somewhere between paper and whisper, as truths in fleets tend to be. On B-59's bridge that night, salt sleeted sideways and stitched itself into coats. Savitsky stood wrapped to the nose and watched the lights of the north thin and disappear. Beside him, Arkhipov, brigade chief of staff, had brought a quiet authority and a memory of graves from the K-19 incident that was not yet history, but still injury. Maslenikov, the political officer, had the posture of a man sworn to be a spine for others. Behind them were 70 sailors and a signals group tasked with pulling whispers from a noisy sky. They were mostly boys who had memorized slogans well enough to believe them until belief was inconvenient. They were also professionals who knew the sound of a bearing and the taste of oil and how to get a submarine from one ocean to another without being seen too much. By October 22nd, when the quartet had worked its way down through gales, past anti-submarine patrol lines, and into the Sargasso, the radio told them the theater had gotten an audience. President John F. Kennedy spoke into American living rooms and bled across the spectrum into a cramped room on B-59, missiles in Cuba, a quarantine, a promise that a nuclear shot from the island would be answered by a shot at the USSR itself. The words traveled on a civil frequency, but they were military in all the ways that matter. Some men listening were impressed by the grammar. Others were impressed by the part where their lives had become a paragraph in a speech. The U.S. Navy bent the ocean to its will. By the 24th, it had thrown a ring of 200 ships and almost as many patrol planes into the Atlantic, approaches to Cuba. a scale of anti-submarine ambition not seen since the last war that the older chiefs still talked about as if it had ended yesterday. There were memoranda in Washington about how to treat found submarines, not torpedoes, not depth bombs, not real destruction, but signal charges and 5-count rhythms that would make a Soviet captain choose humiliation over hypoxia. The nicety here was doctrinal, the reality was percussion. The Notmar, the notice to mariners, said practice depth charges would be used to call a submarine up. The men who had to feel the bangs were not provided a footnote explaining the difference between practice and attack when a hull rings like a bell. In an ExCom meeting, the president put the worry in his own words. Isn't there some way we can avoid having our first exchange with a Russian submarine? Almost anything but that? The sentence would not reach the control room of B-59, but it would matter in rooms where orders were drawn in pencil and fear. October 25th to 26th. B-59 learned the American rhythm the hard way. Night snorkel to feed the diesels, radar plucks the mast out of the dark, dive on batteries, wait in stale air until the numbers say it is barely safe to try again. A sister boat, B-130, broke first, forced to the surface under the eyes of a carrier group and a line of destroyers eager to be seen doing their jobs. In Washington that morning, the day's schedule was rewritten around a question. What do we do with a surfaced Soviet submarine that raises a red flag and looks back at us? The answer was choreography, escort, and glare, and let it slip away rather than make an incident out of a humiliation. The president's people were already learning that every small victory had to be framed such that the other side could choose not to bleed. If you wanted the crisis to end, you had to make each step back from the edge look like something a proud man could do and still walk into a meeting. October 27th. Black Saturday. A U-2 falls out of the sky over Cuba in a streak of smoke. Another U-2 strays over Siberia and plays geography with the northern lights until the wrong interceptors rise. In the Caribbean, destroyers and planes bake the water with engine heat and human certainty. The USS Randolph's air wing is an insistence overhead. Trackers to listen, fighters to scare, pilots with orders to intimidate without killing, and a pilot's natural impatience with half measures. On the surface that evening, when B-59 finally comes up, the men will see Randolph spelled on a carrier's aft like a billboard, proof that their hunters had been orchestral rather than random. At that hour below, none of this is poetry. It is only the sound of pings and the taste of an air that doesn't want them anymore. American destroyers pass messages among themselves in zippered language and decide where to drop another string of charges. The Coney starts the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the recognized signal for come up and talk. The C translates 5 into a bruise that repeats. On B-59, the CO2 scrubbers work as hard as they can against a chemistry problem that does not care about patriotism. The batteries flick from comfortable to conservative to dangerous. In the stern, a machinist's mate stares at a gauge and tells it to make better decisions. The gauge declines. The doctor bundles a sailor who fell where he stood and writes a note he will misplace. By afternoon, the hunt has a number of ships, a dozen plus, and a patience that feels like hatred. By evening, the American ring is tighter, the air inside is thinner, and the number of times a Soviet officer has to say, "Hold your post," is one more than he thought possible when he learned the sentence. The rest, the stronger blast, the ladder in the throat of the conning tower, the searchlights and cannon stitching the sea alongside, Arkhipov putting his body where the next bad decision wants to go, belongs to the minute that has already been told. It is told again because the world likes repetition at the points where it almost ended. Captain Savitsky's order meets Maslenikov's objection, meets Arkhipov's insistence, and in that mathematics, a different sum appears. The nuclear torpedo remains a noun rather than a verb. B-59 becomes a hull on a lit stage rather than a shockwave under one. The Americans, not knowing what they almost bought, perform their procedures: spotlight, loudhailer, gun crews at ready, destroyer cutting the bow too close because someone always wants to put his signature on a day like this. The Soviets, knowing too much, perform theirs: answer the lamp, raise the aerial, take the message, leave. The Randolph watches, the Coney logs. The Beale's deck log holds tidy words that sit embarrassingly beside what the sea actually felt like. PDCs dropped, contact maintained, submarine surfaced. The paper sings of order. The body remembers fear. A slow rewind to the hours before the ring, because the hour makes more sense in context than in isolation. Foxtrot-class boats like B-59 were long-legged diesel wolves built to haunt sea lanes and coasts, not to thrive in tropical water. Their hulls held big battery banks, and their snorkels were the mechanical compromise that let them breathe without full exposure. But nothing in their design imagined a day-after-day pursuit at the equator's archive of heat. Every time a Foxtrot sprinted to meet its schedule, the sprint would be paid back with a long snorkel on the surface or at periscope depth. Every long snorkel was a request to radar and radio to please notice. In a North Atlantic autumn, the sea and weather could disguise that cycle. In the Sargasso, the water was flat and too honest. The U.S. Navy, which had spent 2 wars turning anti-submarine work into a science, exploited the cycle with the satisfaction of men doing a familiar job well. Sonobuoys listened, destroyers pushed, ASW planes signaled and scolded. The policy said charges with small loads and a repeatable pattern. The practice added the human extras: a plane flying a little lower than choreography demands, a destroyer turning a little closer because fear looks like aggression from far away. In Washington, the ExCom room was a different kind of heat. By the morning of the 27th, men had not slept, and the vocabulary of options had thinned to words with short handles: airstrike, invasion, blockade, quarantine. Letters from Khrushchev with metaphors about ships and currents, and letters to Khrushchev with metaphors about responsibilities and promises. The president asked for ways not to have the first exchange be with a submarine, because submarines are places where misunderstanding becomes irreversible quickly. Practice depth charges as signal had been the compromise, crafted to be safe on paper and tolerable in a room where the only truly safe option sounded too much like do nothing. The problem with compromise is that it involves at least 2 parties understanding exactly what is being compromised. B-59 did not get the memo. On the Soviet side, Operation Anna Dwyer had been built on audacity and secrecy, the belief that a freighter becomes a needle if it sails with enough confidence. The submarines were a side bet: 4 steel letters meant to make a United States admiral measure twice. The bet was made without fully pricing the tropical heat on a Foxtrot, or how thoroughly the Americans could fill a rectangle of ocean. Orders for the nuclear torpedo were deliberately ambiguous in the way orders are when they are written by men who want initiative and deny blame. The presence of Arkhipov on B-59 changed even that ambiguity: a third professional conscience in the room, a third hand on the lock, a third pair of eyes in the ledgers of consequences. Later accounts would disagree on how much Maslenikov signed up for the captain's rage before signing up for Arkhipov's restraint. That is the way of memories told after careers have ended. What remains in all versions is the requirement. With Arkhipov aboard, a nuclear launch required all 3 senior officers' consent, and the fact that the consent was not given. Night on the surface is a different war. When B-59 came up and airplanes ran at it with searchlights, when destroyers set their guns and their lamps, the choreography was intimate and humiliating. The megaphone voices were English and the gestures were international: stop, identify, behave. The Randolph kept her distance but owned the horizon. Her planes did the rude work. At least one pilot decided that warning bursts laid in the water were clearer than a lamp. Men on B-59's bridge felt blindness like a weapon. Those minutes had their own gravity. Savitsky, who had just decided to not drown the ring in atomic pressure, had to withstand the urge to say, "I changed my mind." Arkhipov stood close and made the boat do small civil things: signal back, keep course, keep the torpedo room quiet, which is how one survives humiliation without turning it into tragedy. When the radio finally brought orders, north, return, he said nothing because there was nothing to add. The statement meant someone else solved the day. Do not unsolve it. October 28th to 29th. The Americans peeled away at the edge of their map. B-59's bow pointed home, and the boat began to breathe like a convalescent, still shallow, still careful, but with the possibility of more air and less fear. The crew did the things crews do after tightrope minutes. They slept wrong and woke guilty for sleeping. They laughed at nothing because laughing is an easy way to confess relief. They ate whatever was left and called it food. They wrote brief lines in notebooks they kept and would never show anyone. Maslenikov spoke a few sentences over the intercom about honor, that it had been kept, that keeping it sometimes looked like not firing. Savitsky wrote the kind of log entry that says nothing because everything said would be used later by someone who had not heard the bangs. Arkhipov took his turn on the bridge and let the wind say the words the boat could not afford. The carriers were behind them. So were the searchlights and the planes. The ring, that nightmare geometry, was broken by distance and time. To understand how close the day had been, you have to sit in two rooms at once, the control room of B-59 and an ExCom table in Washington, and consider the speed of misread signals. In B-59, the pattern of 5 charges, by doctrine a signal, felt like assault. Then the larger bang made it feel like confirmation. At the ExCom table, the notion of practice depth charges felt like reasonable pressure, noise attacks, harmless by design, meant to be read by professionals on the other side. Everyone was correct in their immediate logic, and everyone was wrong together. That is how catastrophe tends to start. Who were the hunters? Logs and memoirs, tidy and boastful in different proportions. Name USS Coney and USS Beale as the tightest on the scent, with other destroyers crowding in, Botch, Barry, Charles P. Cecil, and more, as the evening wore on. Randolph's trackers gave them eyes and a prod, and pilots made choices that felt like initiative and look, in hindsight, like provocation. Deck logs show the PDCs, the contact reports, the surfacing notation typed as if nothing trembled while the typing was done. In one recollection from years later, an American sailor confesses to hand grenades stuffed into cardboard tubes to make a louder underwater slap because the practice charges were not satisfying. It is exactly the small human edit that takes a doctrine built to avoid war and turns it toward one. Who were the hunted? A foxtrot designed for cooler seas, fighting heat and chemistry in a theater it wasn't made for? A captain who had rehearsed 100 scenarios, but not the one where you are strangled by heat and sound at a depth just shy of your boat's patience? A political officer who had memorized the rules and had to weigh them against the moment? A chief of staff whose specialty was surviving worst-case scenarios and talking other people out of them? Arkhipov had been forged the previous year when K-19's reactor braid burned through normal procedure and asked for a new category of bravery, men stepping into lethal radiation, because if they did not, there would be a meltdown. He watched 22 die from that action in the months that followed. From that day forward, his reflex was to buy time when all other commodities were unavailable. On Black Saturday, he bought the most expensive seconds a man has ever bought with only a sentence: return. The northern seas are a merciful cold after the Sargasso. Steel likes it better. So do men. The submarine slips into the rituals of base and debrief and the dense language of reports meant to explain without accusing. Higher officers in the Soviet Navy will be half proud, half annoyed. The boats were discovered. The boats lived. The boats did not fire. Depending on which half of a career you want to feed, you can make any of those facts the headline. There are muttered lines in offices about captains who allow themselves to be forced up like blind kittens. There are also the kinds of private smiles professionals exchange when a disaster is avoided, and no one outside the room will give you a medal for the privilege of going to bed alive. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself unwinds over the next 36 hours in a correspondence of letters and promises. Khrushchev writes, Kennedy answers, the quarantine becomes a hostage to adjectives. An agreement is reached about missiles leaving Cuba and no invasion. And a quiet trade about Jupiters in Turkey happens where cameras cannot look. In public, both leaders learn the art of making a step back look like a step forward. In private, men on both sides count the near misses and make lists of what to fix. Some of the fixes are obvious, more direct lines between leaders, better rules about who gets to pull which trigger. Some of the fixes are illusions, technology that promises to remove human error by removing humans, and thereby removes the exact hesitation that saved the world at least twice that month. Years later, documents will come out of archives tired of the dark. A declog here, a memo there, a diary from a sailor in another boat who wrote about heat and thirst and charges like doors slamming. Vadim Orlov, the signals officer on B-59, will publish an account that gives the crisis its most quoted line, Savitsky's vow to die and sink them all, and his memory will be called controversial by some and necessary by others. Memories are always cross-examined by men who wanted to be braver in their own. Arkhipov will give an interview in 1997 that recounts the searchlights, the low passes, the plane that blinded the bridge, the 300 rounds into the water that felt like the definition of the word attack. The National Security Archive will collect the pieces, Beale and botched decklogs, ExCom notes about practice charges, Soviet recollections, a carrier's launch schedule, a photo of B-59 on the surface with a helicopter hovering like a patient vulture. It will assemble a day that happened in absolute real time and absolute uncertainty and can only be fully seen in hindsight. In that hindsight, Black Saturday takes its proper place, the most dangerous day, and the world learns that men underwater almost settled an argument meant for men in suits. Back into the room, because endings are built out of ordinary minutes, not drum rolls. Someone wipes condensation off a bulkhead with the edge of his sleeve and leaves a clean arc in the grime. Someone else finds a pencil he doesn't own and sticks it behind a pipe for whoever will need it next watch. The doctor checks a sailor's pulse and declares it adequate to get the man to port. The machinists whisper to their machines the way farmers whisper to weather. Maslenikov folds and refolds a piece of paper until the fold is evidence of having been useful. Savitsky stares at the chart as if it had been personally offensive and then looks away because it was not the chart that tried to kill him. Arkhipov notes a bearing and writes a number and scratches out the number and writes it again more neatly. A man who knows that sometimes the only dignity left is the neatness of writing what happened. The cold wind off the Barents, the lines thrown and caught, a gangway, boots on a pier that smells like fish and oil, and the sort of victory that refuses to feel like triumph. There will be meetings where the words procedure and initiative are made to wrestle. There will be reports that choose one adjective over another. There will be a fleet that moves from crisis to routine, because that is how fleets survive the fact that they nearly didn't. There will be men who go home to apartments with radiators that clang, to wives who ask the right questions and accept the wrong answers, to children who will later learn from a book what their fathers did not tell them. And there will be one sentence, not a slogan, Not a doctrine, just a sentence said on a ladder in a wash of white light that keeps echoing long after the searchlights are off. Wait. They're signaling. October 27, 1962. Sargasso Sea, control room. The hands on the clock remember the minute. The torpedo room remembers it too, the way a crew can stand in a space with a weapon that changes the name of the world and not touch it, because one man told another man to wait. The hull remembers the blows and the rings they made. The battery room remembers a number so low, the lamp made a smaller lamp around itself, and the human eye decided to work anyway. The sonar shack remembers the repetition of pings and what it was to want silence more than it wanted sleep. The bridge remembers the searchlight that turned the night to bone, and the plane riding it, implacable and accurate and also merciful, because the rounds went into water and not into steel. B-59 remembers the day as a body remembers a fever, partial, unpleasant, a record of surviving, rather than a story about being brave. What else happened on Black Saturday? A U-2 died over Cuba. Another got lost near the pole and stumbled into someone else's airspace. ExCom argued over maps that looked small for the things put on them. Khrushchev wrote a letter that was half love note to peace and half ultimatum about rights at sea. Kennedy worried about the first exchange being with a submarine for reasons that will read like prophecy when the National Security Archive posts the transcript decades later. 1,000 men in uniform made 100 small additions to a doctrine, and a single subtraction, don't shoot, made at the right time, carried the day. When the story is told in classrooms, it will be simplified because time is scarce and the human brain prefers clear lessons. It will be turned into a map with arrows and a bullet list under photos of Kennedy and Khrushchev and a sentence about a submarine that surfaced because it was signaled loudly. The longer version, the one with heat and CO2, with searchlights and a pilot's preference for strafing the water, with sons of a country deciding whether to start a war without asking their fathers, belongs to books and rooms where people have time to listen. In those rooms, a name that stayed mostly quiet during a lifetime acquires its proper size: Vasili Arkhipov. He was a second captain on paper, and the difference between silence and a sound no one wanted to hear, in fact. The U.S. deck logs went to boxes. The Soviet recollections went to drawers. Later, the National Security Archive gathered them into a shape. The shape says, B-59 was found, pursued, signaled with practice charges, forced to surface, and chose not to fire. The shape says, a nuclear torpedo at 10 kilotons existed in a tube that night, and it could have been used if 3 human beings had agreed rather than 2. The shape says, the Americans did not know about the nuclear torpedoes and would have changed their procedures if they had. Kennedy, who already worried about submarines, would have had new reasons to worry. The shape says, luck and judgment are often hard to tell apart when you need both. Some particulars because the style requires them, and because particulars are the difference between myth and history. B-59 carried 22 torpedoes, including 1 T-5 nuclear, with a yield on the order of a Hiroshima-class device. The warhead was kept under lock. Firing required procedure and consent. The U.S. Navy's NOTMAR and ExCom guidance called for practice depth charges, small charges in a 5-bang pattern, to signal Soviet submarines to surface rather than to attack them with lethal depth bombs. On October 27th, USS Coney and USS Beale held the tightest sonar contact and dropped the practice charges. USS Batch and others closed. USS Randolph's air wing performed the overflights and mock attacks, noted by Arkhipov and remembered by Orlov. Archipov's 1997 recollection, translated and published later, describes searchlights that blinded the bridge, planes passing 20 to 30 meters overhead, guns trained on the sub, automatic fire with 300 rounds into the water, and destroyers cutting across the bow at dangerous distance. His account frames the moment when, Had Savitsky ordered an emergency dive, the perception of being under attack would have hardened into an order to fire. Vadim Orlov's 2002 account supplies the "sink them all, do not disgrace the Navy" outburst in the control room when a stronger explosion struck near the hull and the captain ordered the nuclear torpedo readied. The account is labeled controversial in places because other officers later doubted Savitsky would say it aloud, but the deck logs, ASW photos, and Soviet recollections together make the pressure of that minute unarguable. With Arkhipov aboard as Brigade Chief of Staff, the nuclear launch required unanimous approval by the captain, the political officer, and the brigade deputy commander, and it did not get it. These details are listed not to drain the drama, but to prove it. A coda inside the same day because the day held multitudes. While the destroyers were drawing circles around B-59, while the plane's searchlight was a second artificial sun, while Arkhipov was holding a man's shoulder and telling him to wait, a different conversation was happening in Washington. A letter from Moscow promising to remove missiles if invasion was renounced. Another letter proposing a Turkey trade in vaguer language. Telephones that did not ring fast enough because there was no hotline yet to ring on. Brothers switching roles between hawk and dove in the space of an hour. Soldiers on Okinawa and Florida testing launch keys and then not turning them. The sea is where one thread of the crisis burned hottest. The air and rooms were where the others did. When the deal comes, it comes too late to help B-59 and just in time to help everyone else. Aftermath in the smallest possible key, because that is how this style prefers to end a day and leave the rest implied. A fogged mirror in a compartment clears and reveals a face that looks older than its passport. A sailor peels tape off a label on a locker and puts the tape in his pocket without knowing why. A petty officer retrieves his lucky icon, a secret he would deny in any political interview, touches it to the pipe that sweated over him for 18 hours, and puts it away for the next time he has to be superstitious. Maslenikov writes 2 lines in a notebook about duty and crosses out one of them because it sounds like he is quoting someone. Savitsky stares through a porthole at a sea that is finally unremarkable and feels a matching unremarkability bloom in his chest where rage had lived. Arkhipov stands a moment longer than the schedule allows near the torpedo room, not looking at tube number 1, and then goes forward to check a bearing he already knows is correct. Above them, in other rooms, other men prepare the communiques that will close the crisis. The searchlights are off. The guns are at rest. The clock is ordinary again. The ocean keeps moving as if it had not been asked to hold its breath for a day. And B-59, a black shape under a blacker sky, carries it 70 stories north, each man's version of the same minute stacked beside the others until the stack becomes history. The signal that mattered, the one that did not explode, was an idea, not a sound. Wait. The boat waited. The world kept the appointment it did not know it had with morning.